They laughed at him, and at his horse everywhere. Marshal Virgil Hardin had seen more than his share of broken things. A man who'd worn a badge for 2 decades knew all about shattered trusts and fractured promises, but the saddest sight he'd laid eyes on in weeks was a mangy roan gelding, tucked away in the back of the livery auction in Redemption Creek. While other riders clapped the flanks of sleek, muscular quarter horses, this animal stood motionless, its head hung low. Sunlight glinted off the rusted brand scarring its hide, and its ribs were a series of harsh ridges beneath a dull, matted coat. Virgil had exactly $10 in his pocket, every cent of his meager savings since he'd hung up his star and sought a quieter life. He was a long way from the frontier he once patrolled, and without a reliable mount, he couldn't even make a decent living as a simple courier. The thoroughbreds were fetching $50, $60, even $70. The dependable pack mules were going for $20 to $30. Virgil's $10 felt like a joke in his hand. That's when the auctioneer, Silas Kincaid, turned his attention to the sad-looking roan. "This here beast," Silas boomed, "is more of a hazard than a horse. Got a mind to pay someone to haul it off. We'll start the bidding at $7, though I can't imagine why." The crowd snickered and looked away. Silas sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. $5 then. Anyone? Only the buzz of flies answered him. Virgil felt a strange pull as he looked at the roan. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a shared sense of being an outcast, of having outlived one's purpose. $3, Virgil called out, his voice a low rumble that cut through the silence. A few men turned to him, their faces a mixture of surprise and open amusement. A voice from the back muttered, "There's a fool and his money." Silas looked around one last time before his hammer fell. Sold to the marshal with the patched hat. $3 for the old road dust. As Virgil approached the roan, he felt a flicker of hope. The horse, which hadn't moved a muscle, finally lifted its head. For a moment, its eyes locked with Virgil's. They were deep and dark, not filled with defeat, but with an eerie intelligence, a look that spoke of 1,000 miles and a secret that had been kept for a very long time. The roan, which Virgil decided to call Shadow, refused to follow the main trail that led to his secluded cabin. Virgil tugged on the rope, trying to steer the horse back toward the worn wagon ruts. "Come on, old man," he murmured. "We've got to get you some proper feed and a fresh bucket of water." But Shadow planted his hooves and turned his head toward the desolate hills that loomed behind the valley, a jagged expanse of rock and thorny brush. Virgil knew this land. It was known as the Blackwood's Folly, named for a prospector who had vanished there decades ago. "There's nothing but ghosts up there," Virgil said, his voice laced with the weary authority of a man who had seen too many dead ends. The horse whinnied, a sound that was more of a command than a complaint, and looked back at Virgil with an unmistakable sense of urgency. For a moment, Virgil considered following the unspoken suggestion, but the logic of his life as a marshal reasserted itself. He had his own ghost to outrun, and a new start to build. He gave the rope a firm pull, and Shadow reluctantly followed, but the animal's gaze remained fixed on the hills, as if leaving behind something of immense importance. When they arrived at Virgil's weathered cabin, Shadow didn't settle down. He stood in his makeshift stall, his ears pricked, staring toward the craggy skyline. He ignored the grain Virgil offered, barely touching the oats. "What is it you're looking for?" Virgil asked, more to himself than the horse. Shadow simply turned his head, met Virgil's gaze, and then lowered his nose to the dusty floor, as if pointing to the very spot where he stood. Virgil, still a practical man, simply shook his head and went inside. But the horse's peculiar behavior weighed on his mind. By dawn, Shadow was gone. Virgil stared at the empty pen, his heart sinking with a familiar sense of failure. $10 wasn't much, but it was all he had left. He felt like a fool, robbed in broad daylight by an animal he'd paid for. But as he stepped outside, a flicker of movement on the distant hillside caught his eye. There, standing still as a statue halfway up the slope, was Shadow. He wasn't running away. He was waiting. A flash of understanding hit Virgil. The horse hadn't escaped. He had simply gone where he wanted to go all along. Virgil grabbed his canteen and began the grueling climb. The sun beat down, and the rocky terrain was unforgiving. He cursed the loose stones that shifted beneath his boots, but Shadow remained where he was, a silent beacon. When Virgil finally reached him, the horse immediately turned and began walking deeper into the hills, his stride confident and purposeful. "This is madness," Virgil muttered, but he followed. He was a marshal, and he was being led by a horse. What a way for a career to end. After an hour of climbing, Shadow stopped beside a series of decaying wooden posts and twisted metal. It was the remains of an old mining operation, long since forgotten. Virgil saw the rusted rails of a narrow-gauge track peeking through the overgrown brush. Shadow walked to a specific spot and began to paw at the ground, not in frustration, but with a deliberate, rhythmic motion, like he was uncovering a secret. Virgil knelt down and began to dig, his fingers brushing aside layers of dry earth. He felt something hard and metallic, a small iron ring, green with age. It was a trapdoor, perfectly concealed. The horse took a step back, as if its task was complete. Virgil's heart pounded with a mix of fear and adrenaline. Whatever was down there had been hidden for a reason, but a marshal knew that sometimes you had to face the unknown head-on. The trapdoor groaned open, revealing a black void. A chill, dusty air drifted up, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and forgotten ambition. Virgil took a deep breath, lit a match, and lowered himself into the darkness. The rungs of a rickety wooden ladder creaked under his weight as he descended into the silence. When his boots hit the floor 20 feet down, he raised the match. The flame illuminated a narrow tunnel supported by thick timber beams. Mine cart tracks ran along the ground, disappearing into the blackness. But what made Virgil's heart skip a beat was what he saw lacing the walls, not just specks of silver, but wide, gleaming veins of gold and silver ore, catching the light like a celestial river frozen in stone. This wasn't a claim, it was a king's ransom. The match burned down to his fingers, and he lit another. Deeper in the tunnel he saw something else carved into a support beam. AB 1872. Below that, scratched in desperate letters, was a warning. "They're coming. Hide the ledgers. The devil's own will claim this. Let no man follow." A chill ran down Virgil's spine. This mine hadn't been abandoned. It had been sealed. He saw old heavy hoofprints in the dust, as if burdened animals had carried heavy loads down this path. The second match went out, but in the final flicker he saw them. A stack of worn canvas bags piled against the wall, and they were not empty. Outside, Shadow whinnied softly, a distant sound that was both a warning and a call. Virgil tore open the first bag, and a cascade of gold and silver coins spilled onto the floor, glittering like spilled starlight. Hundreds of old doubloons, ancient and pure. The sound of distant horses reached his ears. They were coming fast. He stuffed his coat and pockets with as many coins as he could carry, the weight a heavy comfort. He grabbed 2 of the smaller bags and slung them over his shoulder. He'd never be poor again. He climbed the ladder as quickly as he could, pushing the heavy trapdoor shut and scattering dust over it just as 3 riders crested the hill. They were well-dressed men, their horses a fine breed, and their rifles expensive. They weren't simple prospectors. "The old Blackwood's Folly should be right here," one of them said, his voice sharp and confident. "The survey says Blackwood buried his stash here before the Red River raiders got him." Virgil's blood ran cold. He pressed himself against a boulder, pulling Shadow behind him. 20 years we've been looking," another rider groaned. "That family's fortune has to be here somewhere. The old owner of this land died last month. We can just buy the whole place and tear these hills apart." Virgil's skin went cold. They were talking about his land. The riders split up, riding in a methodical search. Virgil waited until they were out of sight before following Shadow as the horse led him down a hidden canyon, a path that would keep them out of sight. That night Virgil barely slept, the weight of the coins a constant reminder of his new, dangerous secret. At dawn he rode straight to Redemption Creek, Shadow moving with a renewed strength and purpose. The county courthouse stood at the center of the dusty main street. Inside, the clerk looked up from his ledger with a bored expression. "I'm filing a mining claim," Virgil stated, laying a gleaming gold doubloon on the counter. The old man's eyes widened. "The Blackwood's Folly? That land's known as a curse. Nothing but bad luck there. You sure you want to waste your money?" "I'm sure," Virgil said, his voice even. The clerk stamped the papers, his surprise evident. As Virgil exited the courthouse holding his legal documents, He saw the 3 riders from yesterday dismounting across the street. Their leader looked up, and his eyes met Virgil's. A flicker of recognition, and then cold fury crossed the man's face. Virgil mounted Shadow calmly, but his heart was pounding. When they arrived back at his cabin, 2 more well-dressed men were waiting on his porch. Marshal Hardin, the taller one, said with a cold smile, "We represent certain interests. We understand you've come into some property recently." "This farm's been in my family for years," Virgil said, his hand hovering over his sidearm. "We're not talking about the farm," the second man said. "We're talking about the mining claim you filed this morning. We'd like to make a very generous offer. $1,000 for your claim. Cash money." The offer was staggering, but Virgil looked at Shadow, who was watching him intently. "Not interested," he said flatly. The smiles vanished. "That's unfortunate, Marshal, because that claim belongs to people who are very good at protecting their investments." As they rode off, Virgil knew the real fight had just begun. The attack came at midnight. Virgil woke to Shadow's enraged screams, a sound that split the night stillness, a cry of pure prehistoric fury that was more animal than horse. He grabbed his rifle from its rack with a marshal's instinct, his heart hammering against his ribs, and ran barefoot into the darkness. 5 men surrounded the barn, their grim faces illuminated by the eerie glow of their torches. They hadn't come for conversation. They'd come to burn the place to the ground, to destroy his home, his evidence, and his life, making the claim papers vanish in the smoke. But they hadn't anticipated Shadow. The horse had kicked open his stall door with a thunderous crack, and was now a whirlwind of teeth and hooves, a black fury of bone and muscle. He moved with a speed that defied his age and frame, his hooves pounding the dirt with the force of a hammer. One attacker was already a motionless heap in the dust, blood streaming from his head. "Shoot the cursed animal," a man yelled. But before Virgil could get a clean shot, Shadow did something extraordinary, a maneuver of calculated intelligence. He snapped his powerful jaw around a burning torch, and with a violent flick of his head, sent the fiery wood spinning directly at the pile of hay the men had stacked against the barn wall. But instead of setting a blaze, he scattered the kindling before it could catch, his actions clear and precise. The horse wasn't just fighting, he was protecting his secret, protecting the very place where Virgil had buried the sturdy metal lockbox with the claim papers beneath the barn's foundation. The battle was over in minutes, the attackers' assault a chaotic scramble. 3 men were left groaning on the ground, while the 2 others vanished into the darkness, with the panicked chaos of a retreating ambush. Shadow stood unharmed, his chest heaving, his dark eyes still blazing with a cold fire. Virgil ran to him, but the horse simply lowered his head, as if the night's work was done. Yet, Virgil knew with a gut certainty that this was only the beginning. Over the next few days, word spread like wildfire across the territory, carried on the whispers in saloons and echoed in stories around every campfire. The marshal who'd bought a cursed broken-down horse had found a king's fortune that belonged to the Finch family. The story brought a relentless parade of characters to Redemption Creek. Grizzled prospectors arrived with picks and worn maps. Slick-tongued lawyers showed up with legal papers and offers of partnership, and well-dressed agents from Eastern syndicates came with offers of cash and thinly veiled threats. But Virgil, with Shadow a constant silent presence at his side, held firm. He never sold his claim, refusing to part with something he'd found through trust, not greed. The gold flowed for 20 years, a steady stream of wealth that he managed with the honesty and discipline of a marshal. He hired good men, built a proper mine, and oversaw every detail himself. The gold allowed him to build a grand estate on the hill, but he never forgot the small leaning cabin or the barn where it all began, often returning there to sit in quiet contemplation. And Shadow, the broken-down horse everyone had rejected, lived in a luxury reserved for royalty. He grazed in endless green pastures, a personal attendant seeing to his every need, his spirit finally at peace. People came from all over to hear the legendary story of Virgil's fortune, but he never told them the whole truth. He never revealed that the horse hadn't just led him to a forgotten mine, he had led him back to himself. The secret was that true wealth wasn't in the gold itself, but in the ability to recognize value where others saw ruin, and to trust that some of life's most valuable partnerships are found in the most unexpected places. Thanks for riding with us through another tale of the Old West. If you'd like more nights like this, saddle up and join us here on Sleep West. There's always another story waiting, just beyond the horizon.